If you want to turn to Hebrews, that is where we are. We will finish chapter 6 this evening, just in time to take a small break next week as we pause and celebrate and remember and tell stories, continue to tell stories about who Jesus is and what he's done in the absolute unbelievable ride that has been the last 10 years. And so next week, we will pause and remember and celebrate and really probably fall to our knees in thanksgiving for what God has done over the last 10 years. And so it's a great place to stop at the end of chapter 6 and have a break and then start again at the beginning of chapter 7, because at the beginning of chapter 7 is where the author of Hebrews actually starts to describe the importance of this weird name that we have been reading about over the last few chapters, Melchizedek. So we're not going to get there tonight, but it is what we start with when we start back up a week after next. But tonight, we're going to finish Hebrews chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 13 and finish the chapter, which is verse 20. And those of you that are sequential in thought, the title of tonight's message is this: A Promise with the Greatest of Strength. The promise with the greatest of strength. Just allow that, whatever comes to your mind when you think about receiving a promise that has strength behind it. What does that mean for you? Think through that content and that process as I read Hebrews chapter 6, starting in verse 13. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, "Surely I will bless you and multiply you." And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. I finished last week with a couple of statements that I wanted to allow us to move into this week because it completes or it continues the thought of the author. The first statement was this: through faith and patience inherit the promises. You see, if you look at verse 12 of chapter 6, it says, so that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those, here it is, through faith and patience inherit the promises. Now, like any good teacher, any person who wants to communicate a thought, just put yourself in the shoes or the sandals or the flats or whatever you want to call it of the author of Hebrews and say to yourself, why is he, after he says this statement, through faith and patience inherit the promises, why then does he move very quickly into verse 13? What comes to his mind? Well, if you're teaching and you're wanting people to get what you're teaching, there's this thing called illustration, right? There's this metaphor. There's this, hey, I want you to get it because there's something close to you that will make sense to you so that you can bridge the gap and it will start to become clear. And the author cannot think of anything better to demonstrate through faith and patience an inheritance of the promises than Abraham. So the connection between verse 13 and verse 12, the reason he moves right into Abraham is because as he's in the middle of teaching, Abraham is right on the forefront of his mind. This will show an example of patience and faith. The other thing that I said, the very last part of last week, was we need to live the legacy of God. What does it mean to live the legacy of God? how do we take the character of God and the strength of God and the perseverance of God and the goodness of God and the justice of God and the righteousness of God and all of those things that are God, and how do we then internalize them in such a way that we proclaim them in our everyday, nuanced, somewhat boring lives? What does it mean for us to take God in all of his glory and to live in such a way that when people watch our lives, they see his legacy? Again, the author of Hebrews cannot think of a better example than faith and patience than that of Abraham, which would say, here's a man who lived according to the promises of God, the legacy of God. Verses 13 through 15, they're pretty simplistic in what they're trying to communicate. And what they're trying to communicate is simply this: Abraham, the poster child of a life lived by faith and hope. You can go back to Genesis, and we're going to highlight a few of the verses. I'm not going to read them, but you can go back, you can jot them down. You can read about Abram's life, who God renamed into Abraham, and the promise that God promised Abram. And so we're going to get into that. And some of this may be familiar with you if you're familiar with the story of Abraham. And for some, this may not be familiar with you. And so my challenge would be that the passages of Scripture that I quote in Genesis, that you would jot them down, and then throughout the week that you would go back to them so that you can familiarize yourself with this story. Because who is the audience in which the speaker of Hebrews, the author of Hebrews, is speaking to? Jewish people. Jewish people that have surrounded themselves with Greek culture. Jewish people that are on the fence of, is Jesus worth it? Should we continue, despite the unbelievable, enormous persecution, should we continue in our faith? That's the whole chapter of chapter 6 is the author of Hebrews pleading, don't be those. Don't come so close to the truth that you have deceived yourself to believe that you are living in the truth. Be poured over with the truth of Christ in your life. Embrace it, soak it up, get a mouthful that it just comes spitting out, because that's how full you are of the presence of Christ. And so in that audience, Abraham is an example of faith and patience and perseverance and holding a legacy of God. He has captured his audience because he's speaking of their forefather, Abraham. At age 75, God promised Abraham he would make him into a great nation. Abraham is 75 years old. At that time, his name is Abram. And in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, God calls Abram and he gives him a promise that he's going to make him into a great nation. Just to give you a timeline, and some of this will make sense and some of this won't. At age 86, Ishmael was born. Ishmael was Abraham's first son. He was born, and you can read about that account in Genesis 16:16. So at 75, God promises Abraham that he will be made into a great nation, and that he will actually have a descendant. That doesn't make a lot of sense to Abraham at the time. At 86, Ishmael is born, Genesis 16:16, and then at age 100, Isaac is born. Oh, to dream that when I turn 100 years old to have a new baby in the house, right? I mean, what is that about? So at age 100, Isaac is born, Genesis chapter 21, verse 5. Now, as you think about patience, and you think about faith, and you think about perseverance, and you think about a promise with the greatest of strength, we have to understand a little more about Abraham and his journey and his life. So what is this passing of time? You see, it took 25 years before Isaac was born. God promises Abraham at age 75, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Your descendants will be great. At the time, Abraham's thinking, do you know how old I am? And besides that, do you know how old my wife is? And do you know that we have had no children? We cannot have children. It is not possible. God, what are you thinking? You're promising me this, and I am this old? And then 25 years later, as if 75 wasn't old enough, 100 rolls around, and then Isaac is born. It took another 60 years before Jacob and Esau were born. Isaac then has children, and in that line, Jacob and Esau are part of that. Jacob is the one then that inherits the continuation of the legacy of what God is doing in Abraham's life. You see, when these children were 15, Jacob and Esau, Abraham died. Amazing how long people lived back in the day. Abraham dies at 175. 75 to 175, you can do the math. In Genesis 25, verse 7, it describes Abraham's death. And at the time of Abraham's death, according to the promises of God, Abraham had one son of the covenant, Isaac, and one grandson of the covenant, Jacob. Now, you have to kind of get into Old Testament history and understand what God was doing through the line of Abraham. But Abraham, at 75, 100 years go by, and at 175, Abraham is looking towards God in his promise that he will make Abraham a great nation, and he sees one son and one grandson of the covenant. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound so great just from looking at the facts. Now, if we know anything about Abraham, we know that this passing of time didn't come without its distractions. You see, God doesn't choose to use perfect people. In fact, he uses very flawed people to accomplish his purposes, and Abraham was no stranger to flaws. When God originally promised Abraham to make him into a great nation, the first thing that Abraham thought is, well, maybe he's talking about Lot. You can read about Abraham and Lot's relationship in Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 through 17. Lot was the nephew of Abraham, and Abraham just assumed that, well, Lot is related, and he has good land, and he has good wealth, and he has good potential, so I have been unable to produce a child, to produce an heir, so maybe God's going to use Lot to accomplish his promise. And then you know through a series of circumstances that Lot and Abraham separate. They go their separate ways. And so in going their separate ways, Abraham is saying, okay, well, maybe it's not Lot. The next thing that Abraham thinks is, well, if it's not Lot, then I guess the only thing it can be is Eleazar of Damascus. And you read about Eleazar in Genesis chapter 15, verse 2. And Eleazar was basically the general manager of Abraham's house. He was the heir to Abraham because Abraham had no children. And so it was Jewish law that your top worker, servant, slave, it could be a varied amount of relationship, could in fact inherit your wealth after you died because you did not have any descendants to give it to you. So Abraham's thinking, well, God promised this. It can't be Lot. God promised this. Is it going to be Eleazar? And over and over and over again, God says, no, your descendant, your heir is going to come, Abraham, from you and Sarah, your wife. Abraham just couldn't believe that this is where God was going. Didn't God know the trial and the tribulation of what they wanted to do in family planning? So Abraham decided, well, God may need some help in this area. So if it wasn't to be Lot and it wasn't to be Eleazar, well, then maybe it'll be Hagar. It was, again, common practice in that day. Sarah was on board with this, that Sarah and Abraham would basically use a surrogate, and so Abraham would sleep with Hagar, and then they would have the heir. They would accomplish God's promise. But God once again said, no, this is not my plan. Stop trying to solve the problem you think I have with coming through on my promises. As you think through the life of Abraham, Ishmael is born. We don't have time to go through this whole thing. I'm going to get to an illustration later in the message that kind of talks about the significance of one specific person throughout world history. But from Ishmael, Islam is born. So as you think through just the seriousness of historical events, because of Abraham's going around God's plan, Islam is born. There was testing of the promise. As you think about faith and promise and perseverance and the fact that God is using very flawed people to accomplish his purposes, Abraham, after Isaac was in fact born, God did come through on his promises. Sarah did become pregnant at a very old age. She did give birth to a son. They named him Isaac. And God rewarded Abraham through that. But he tested Abraham's willingness to still follow God despite the overwhelming circumstances and asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac as an offering unto the Lord. You find that in Genesis chapter 22, verse 17. I could preach a whole message on Abraham taking Isaac to the altar. And what's interesting, I didn't realize this until the study this week, that when it talks about the wording that it uses in Hebrew to describe the age of Isaac, and we don't really know how old Isaac was when Abraham was taking him to be sacrificed on the altar, but the truth is it could be anywhere from 5 to 30. I never thought about that. So as it describes the time frame of Isaac, it could be anywhere in that 5 to 30 mark. And even if we cut the difference, which I realize this isn't exactly the middle, but we just assume he's 18 or 20, think about what Abraham was going through and trying to deal with God's promise of a great nation, and yet God asking him to sacrifice Isaac. Now, we know that God rewarded Abraham through his faith by continuing to promise this divine covenantal blessing and saving the life of Isaac as a lamb was provided for Abraham to sacrifice that day. But here's the key. Here's why we're going through the history. Here's why the author of Hebrews brings up the poster child of faith and patience and inheriting the promises, because Abraham was commended for his faith. He was commended for his trust in God's plan, yet he did not fully experience what had been promised. If you flip over to chapter 11 of Hebrews and you look at verse 39, it says this, and all of these, and Abraham is in this list of tremendous men and women of faith, and all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. As we get involved into the meat of why Abraham is being used, Abraham lived by faith and a hope that would be completed in Jesus. These are all the facts that Abraham had. God said, I'm going to make you a great nation. I am going to bless you. I am going to make your people great. I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in heaven. And I need you to do this. I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing, not just to your own people. Genesis chapter 12 is a huge verse for God's missionary movement. You're not just going to be a blessing for your fellow fill-in-the-blank culture, but you're going to be a blessing for all nations, all peoples, all languages. That what I'm going to do, Abraham, in your life is going to impact the rest of the world, all cultures, and I'm going to start with you. And Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, even though he never face-to-face saw how that promise would come through in Jesus becoming not just a descendant of all of that, but absolutely becoming the Savior, the Messiah, who then you and I, as followers of Jesus, become heirs to Christ, which means we are the descendants of Abraham. God has made a promise, and he follows through on that promise through the strength of his character. And in the process of waiting, we often find ourselves anticipating. I mean, look at Abraham. He was anticipating. It must be Lot. It must be Eliezer. Maybe it's Hagar. Maybe it's Ishmael. Hey, when God said, hey, I realize you just had a son with Hagar, but this is not my promise. It's not going to be Ishmael. And Abraham says, but he's a good boy. And God says, no, I have a different way. And so there's this anticipation. We try to answer problems that don't exist. Often it moves to a place of confusion. We truly are wondering if we're making any progress and if we are closer or further away from seeing what is supposed to be. Put yourself in Abraham's shoes. 100 years. We don't even live that long. 100 years. He has one son and one grandson that can be linked through God's covenant promise. God's going to make me a what? He's going to make my descendants as great as the stars in the sky? What? And yet there wasn't a doubt in Abraham. There was a perseverant faith that was willing to wait 100 years, and even at the end of that 100 years did not fully see the promises of God come into fruition. What about you? How are you at waiting? I'll be the first to admit, I am horrible at waiting. I hate to wait. I am not a patient person. I'm just not. I think we as a culture often find ourselves as not patient people. When I order from Amazon, I want free shipping and I want it to show up in the next hour. That's what I want. And I'm really upset when it doesn't. It's good that I live in Tucson because the distribution center is in Phoenix and it usually gets here pretty soon, right? How are you at waiting? How has or should your faith, hope, and love been growing because of your trust in God's promises? Last week we talked about faith, hope, and love. And if God has you in a pattern of waiting, if God has you in a place where you feel like He has given you this hope, He has given you this future, He has given you this gift of salvation, how are you at the already not yet? What parts of faith, what parts of hope, what parts of love are you waiting patiently because of the strength that comes through God's promises? Where are you in that trust? How are you doing? Do you trust that God's best may not be what you perceive as best? We're all guilty of that too. Really? I've given the illustration, but we're kind of going down memory lane. And so Angel and I were in college ministry, and we were in Emporia, Kansas. And then from college ministry is really where God kind of nudged us to think about starting a church, and we didn't really want to start it in Emporia for lots of different reasons. And so we're like, hey, let's do the next best thing, God. Yes, maybe you're nudging us to start a church, and yes, maybe there's good reason, and yes, we know that Judges 2:10 exists, but let's just go take a little easier route. And we have really good friends who know us really well, and they're in this really cool Husker Nation city called Lincoln, Nebraska. And let's move there and go on staff in a comfortable church in a comfortable way, and let's do what we feel like you're nudging us there, even though it's not exactly what you're nudging us to do. And so we moved to Lincoln, Nebraska. And I went on staff with a larger church, and I did small group ministry, and I was with friends, with people who had mentored me, people who I respected to the depth of all kinds of things, and yet it was the most miserable year and a half of my life because of that question. Do you trust that God's best may not be what you perceive as best? What I perceived as best was, let me go on staff with older, wiser, people I know, people who can invest in me. Let me get to this bigger church, this better place, this great central location of Lincoln, Nebraska. This is it. We're going to be here forever. And I was sidestepping what God was asking me to do. And in that next year and a half, as I was in the belly of a fish, like Jonah, not doing the things that God wanted me to do, I was just so restless, so disturbed, so not happy with where I was and the decisions that I made. What about you? Verses 16 through 18 move away then from Abraham as the illustration to a nudge of encouragement. If you want to read about Abraham, read about Abraham in Genesis. It's a great story. It's worth preaching sometime. I'll tackle Genesis before I reach 100. For people swear by something, verse 16, greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So, when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. So that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. God pursues our encouragement. That's what that says. It says it in different words and a different way, but it's saying, here's the illustration of Abraham, and maybe you find yourself like Abraham in this place of, yes, God, I know you promised, and I know this is what's set before, and I am being patient, and I am trying to listen, even though I try to sidetrack your promises in my life. And what God says is, let me encourage you. Let me show you that I mean business. Let me show you the strength that my promises provide. Romans chapter 4, verse 16 says, that is why it depends on faith. In order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. What's Paul saying? Paul's saying the gospel is for Gentiles. Paul's saying that the promises of God are not just for the Jewish people. Paul's saying, hey, isn't it awesome that we can inherit the promises of God that were given to Abraham by faith? That we are part of God's plan with his people called the church. So as you read verses 16 through 18, there's two things that come up. The first is the content of the promise. What exactly does God promise? And then the second is not just what God promises, but how he chooses to back it up, and he chooses to back it up through an oath, the oath that backs up God's promises. Now we have to have a little bit of history, again, based on what was happening with the current audience that was reading this letter for the first time, and this is what was going on. You see, it had become common practice to attach meaning to your words by swearing to something of greater significance than yourself. We kind of do that too. I promise. I swear on my mother's grave, right? If you watch Survivor, there's people swearing to all kinds of things so that they can get their false, truth out there so that they can win $1 million. But the people at that time, there are numerous examples through Scripture that people swore by what? They swore by the temple. They swore by Jerusalem. They swore by heaven. They swore by earth. They swore by the name of God. I swear by the temple. I swear by Jerusalem. I swear by King David. I swear. There was this tendency, this movement to say, if you don't believe me, believe whatever I'm going to state, swear that. And so the author of Hebrews knows that that's the common practice. Jesus actually addresses this practice. You can look, I'm not going to read it, in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. So you can read what Jesus says about the practice of swearing to something else. But it's funny that I'm going to mention James chapter 5, verse 12, which I will read, which is just a reiteration of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5. So you're kind of reading it even though you're not really. James chapter 5, verse 12. But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Now get this. This is what I love about God. Here is a people who are used to helping other people believe what they're going to say by swearing by something. I swear by fill in the blank. This is what people practice. Jesus himself condemns the practice. He says, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. James, the brother of Jesus, who writes James, who we've been through the book of James, he just reiterates what his brother said, what Jesus the Messiah says. Hey guys, stop swearing to something greater than you think of yourselves. Just be a person of integrity. Be a genuine person. And yet, in this example, God goes above and beyond. God the Father wants to effectively show the heirs of the promise that they can rely fully on his word. What did the author just finish talking about? People who come so close to salvation. People who, at the end of the day, they've tasted, they've been enlightened, they've walked alongside, and yet they fall flat when it comes to the ability for them to embrace everything that Jesus has to offer for them. Then he turns his attention, he says, but you, my beloved, I know you're not those. What I'm about to talk to you now is I'm going to talk to you about salvation. And then he encourages them, and he says, move forward in faith, hope, and love. Don't look backwards. Be a person that's genuine. And as you become a person of genuine, remember what patience brings. Remember what perseverance brings. Remember what it means to believe in something so strongly that you don't depend on yourself, but you depend on the character of God. And so God says, I know you're used to this practice, so I'm going to accommodate myself to human customs. And what God says is, I'm going to swear an oath. So God steps into the middle of a practice that's somewhat off, and he says, to show you how much I love you, to show you how patient I am with you, to show you how caring and how much I want to listen and be there, because that's how important this salvation, this hope, this thing is, then I'm going to make an oath myself. And so God swears an oath. He is conscious of our weak faith. And therefore, to give added assurance of the complete reliability of God's word, God provides the extra affirmation. God says, I swear by myself. Because of Jesus, we have a confidence to think about the future. And as we have a confidence to think about the future, we have a confidence to think about that because of what God has promised us. You see, there is no greater promise than swearing by the strength of God himself. What God is doing, remember I started verses 16 through 18 by saying God is pursuing our encouragement. God could reach no higher. Nothing higher could be reached. There is no greater height than God swearing by himself. God couldn't say, I swear by the temple. God's greater than the temple. God couldn't say, I swear by my best friend, fill in the blank. He's greater than his best friend. He couldn't swear by this or that or the other. He could only back himself up by the only thing that was equally as great as himself. And so God swears by himself, what I'm saying to you is true. We do this all the time. We understand what it means to step behind people that have done greater things and to aspire for something greater. We as humans try to attain something higher. It's just part of our DNA. There's this great article that talks about the 100 most significant figures in history. It's really interesting. And I was going to print it out, and then I thought, no, and we'll probably put a link on Facebook or the website or something, because that's what we do, so that you can read it for yourselves. But the number one most significant figure in history, and this is collected through all kinds of like crazy stuff, like algorithms and people, and I mean, it's pretty good research. Even though they say at the end of the day, we understand that we made this, so it's not completely conclusive. So one of you may say, really, that person? Well, yeah, but, put the research in that they put in and then argue about it. I don't know, whatever. So the 100 most significant figures in history. Number 1, Jesus. Surprise. Which is kind of interesting, surprising. I mean, if you think through it, this is totally just human bringing up through all kinds of things. Number 3, going back to our story with Abraham, Muhammad. So number 3, most significant person. Interesting that it all pivots on this person called Abraham. There's lots of different things. Thomas Jefferson is number 10. Albert Einstein, number 19. Charlemagne, 22. I won't read all of them. Charles Dickens, 33. The Apostle Paul, 34. Thomas Edison, 40. Sigmund Freud, 44. Galileo, 49. King David, 57. There's poets in here. There's Tchaikovsky, number 63. John F. Kennedy, 71. Cicero, 79. Richard Nixon, 82. Michelangelo, 86. John Calvin, 99. Joan of Arc, 95. So the list is long and good and represents most significant. Why do I bring that up? Well, I bring it up because if I were to promise how my game of basketball was, I would say, I swear by the talent of LeBron James that I'm just as good. Right? No one even laughed. I'm horrible at basketball. Right? I swear on something greater. So if you're going to give a basketball illustration, you would say, hey, I'm going to talk about LeBron James or Kobe Bryant, or back in the day when I was into basketball, maybe Michael Jordan or whatever. Is he still the greatest or is he not? You know, there's debate for that. But if you're going to talk about finances, then I swear that my activity to be good at my finances is just as good as Warren Buffett. So you can trust my financial advice because Warren Buffett has my back, right? I mean, it's that kind of thing. You could go into kids saying, in the home, as I enter into discussion with my family, with my children about something, they say to me, well, Mom said I could. I play the trump card, right? That's what they're doing. Well, Mom said. Well, my kids know that doesn't work in our house. What I say is, okay, well, I'll go talk to Mom, and then they start to shake, right? Because Mom and Dad are on the same page. You can't just throw the trump card because we're going to agree with each other in public, even if we don't in private, and you will never know, right? And so that is part of playing the trump card. God plays the trump card in his promise. I promise that my promises are true because I myself swear to myself. There's one other illustration. This is just really cool. There's no sporting record that's more iconic than the first mile run under 4 minutes. No sporting record in the history of the world is more iconic than the first mile run under 4 minutes. Why? It was run by a British athlete, Roger Bannister, and for many decades, doctors and learned people have suggested that it was physically impossible for a man to run a mile under 4 minutes. People tried and tried and tried and failed and failed and failed. And this man was the first one to run the mile under 4 minutes. But once he did, it broke the psychological barrier. Many others soon followed. It showed the spirits of self-transcendence intrinsic to man. Don't tell me I can't do something. And as soon as someone did, there has been breaking after breaking after breaking of the fastest man on earth. You see, there's something in our heads. I can't do that. Really? Really? Do you trust in a big enough God to accomplish something that you yourself think you cannot do? I can't be part of this thing, God. I can't move to Tucson, Arizona. Second mile, 80% of church plants fail in the first 5 years. All the people that originally moved here, they'll soon take off and they'll leave me here. I mean, there's all kinds of statistics that come up against the mode of church planting, and yet somehow God was big enough in his promises to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish in Second Mile. I can't do this. I mean, I can look at your faces, and I wish I had time. I could look at your faces, and I could talk about your life and the miracles that God has accomplished in your life that it was impossible by man to accomplish. There are birthing of children and survival of all kinds of hard things. And you are the result of trusting in a God that's bigger than anything else but himself. And that's the promise that God gives. So when we think about this concept, this is the question I want you to ask yourself. Is your understanding of God the biblical portrayal of God? This next question, I want you to get it. It's not candy-coated. How do you reduce the power of God by the deficiency of your thoughts or feelings? What comfort do you find in the strength of God's promises? You've heard me say this before. I don't have time to get into it, but it's the difference between saying I believe in God and saying I believe God. There's a difference. You can chew on that and talk about that if you need to, because that's all I'm going to say about it. What comfort do we find in the strength of God's promises? We now find ourselves at verse 18. So that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we have fled for refuge, might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope that has been set before us. God has given us an unchangeable promise. God has confirmed this unchangeable promise with an oath, and God himself cannot lie. Do you believe God? Are you trusting God? Are you following hard after God? Numbers chapter 23, verse 19 says this. This is a great passage. God is not man, that he should lie, or a son of man, that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? When rest is not found in the presence of God, we are declaring that God is a liar. When rest is not found in the promises of God, then what our actions are declaring is that God is a liar, and that is simply not true. You see, the author of Hebrews could camp out on that, and he could really stick it to his audience. He could really make them feel like the little slime balls that they are, and they could, crawl out of the room not feeling any ounce of dignity, any ounce of motivation. But that is not at all what the author chooses. He focuses in on the positive, and this is what he says. He says, we can believe in the promises of God because we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement. Don't feel guilty. Don't feel less than you should. Don't hold all these things against yourself. Look at Abraham. The guy was not perfect. The guy made huge mistakes, but at the end of his life, God credited to him his faith as righteousness. Why? Because it wasn't that at times Abraham wasn't distracted. It was because throughout Abraham's life, his focus, his direction, his single-mindedness, his perseverance was based on the truth of God's promises. We who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before you. We flee to Jesus, and there we find restful hope. God himself has provided hope through the promises of his word. He is our refuge because God's faithfulness, hear this, because God's faithfulness does not eliminate trial. God's faithfulness does not eliminate persecution. God's faithfulness doesn't eliminate suffering. God's faithfulness doesn't eliminate the fact that tomorrow you could wake up and have a really bad, rotten, no good, very bad day. God's faithfulness is not equal to your quote-unquote happiness, but it is equal to your joy. It is equal to your fulfillment. It is equal to Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. It is the ability to say, I have come that you might have life, and what? Have it to the fullest. What God is saying behind his oath, if you stick with me, then you can take refuge and be encouraged that the hope that you have will hold fast. What the author is saying to the original audience is don't give up on Jesus. Jesus is your only. Here comes verse 19 and 20. We have this as a sure and steadfast. Jesus is your only anchor of the soul. A hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus is gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Verses 19 through 20 connect what the author has already said. Don't drift away. Don't be dull of hearing. Don't be a person that in your faith you just start to be idle and then the waves of life remove you. Continue to have the steadfast motor of persevering and pursuing and being caught in the glorious nature of God. And as you do that, you will have a sure, steadfast anchor. Our anchor of hope has absolute security that Jesus, in his human form, now glorified, has entered heaven. He is now sitting at the right hand of the Father, and he is a guarantee so that you and I can experience the promises of God. It's directly connected to Jesus. This guarantee is indicated by the phrase, who went before us. Jesus is the forerunner. We're already forgiven as God's children. Our future is already set bright as God's children. His declaration of his love is already there because we are his. He looks at you and he sees the covering of the blood of his Son, and he celebrates the worthiness of Jesus, despite the fact that maybe in your life, apart from Jesus, there's some unworthiness. With Jesus, you are worthy. No matter what may be or what may come, with God, through Jesus, your future, the future, anyone's future, with God, through Jesus, is bright. It's bright. It doesn't matter what you're struggling with. It doesn't matter what you have struggled with. It doesn't matter that you are in the absolute worst part of life right now. If you will take hold and begin to focus on Christ, your problems will not go away. But you will begin to understand the anchor that is Christ. And you will begin to find victory and freedom and healing. But it takes the intentionalness of saying, this anchor I'm going to throw out into the open abyss, and I'm going to believe in the promises of God that says Jesus will grab that anchor and hold me tight. I really believe in the simplicity of this life-changing reality. No matter what may come, no matter what may be, with God through Jesus, the future is bright. And the question is, do you? Do you believe that? Do you live that? Do you talk about that? The last question of the evening is this: how is your life an active demonstration of the trustworthiness of the character of God? How is your life an active demonstration of the trustworthiness of God? We have this, verse 19, as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. When Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become the great high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. When it comes to humanity, there's suffering. When it comes to the reality of our lives, there's things that cannot be explained. But despite those hardships, God promises something that's more significant than the right here, right now. And what he promises is that in the future, you can have a hope that is tied to eternity that can start right now. So where is that line? Is it attached to your soul? And is it attached to Jesus? And despite what comes in the here and now, do you see that your future is bright? God, I pray that we would continue to wrestle with hope. Hope that endures. Hope that risks. Hope that believes in the strength and the depth of your promises. Hope that realizes there is nothing greater on this earth or in the universe or beyond anything that we could ever imagine than you, God. I pray that we would have a confidence as your children. I pray that we would see the significance that if we follow you, if we know you, if we've placed our life before you, if we've asked for the forgiveness of sin, and as you have taken the intentionality and moved towards us and allowed us to understand who you are, that if we embrace you, that there is such a confidence that we are part of the promise that you gave to Abraham. That Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in heaven. How beautiful it is that I am one of Abraham's stars. That God, you do come through. There is no character stronger than you. There is no one able to accomplish what he says he will do than you. God, may we rest, may we have our hope, may we be encouraged that despite what we might be feeling or going through or physically having to deal with, you are worth it.